I gotta say, like, I have missed us. I'm glad we're back. I'm glad. No, I really am. I'm glad we're back.
Yeah, I mean, that makes one of us for sure. I'm just kidding. Right. I missed us too.
No, and Jerry, it is so great to have you here. So, Jerry, we are not here to talk about founder versus investor, but we are going to have you and Liz back at some point to talk about founder versus investor because. So, Adam, do you know that this book that Jerry co-wrote?
No.
Okay, it's called Founder versus Investor, and it's basically a bunch of different subjects that come up in a startup with the founder's perspective, which is Liz Zalman, and the investor's perspective, which is Jerry.
Wait, like on the same events?
On just like the same concept. And
this sounds great.
It is extraordinary. It is so good, Jerry.
We're still friends after writing it together. That's the crazy thing.
And you should just be totally good. When I say it's so good, I mean what Liz says is so good. I mean, obviously, what you say is just, yeah, of course, you.
Jerry, are you of a vintage to know this Roseanne Barr, Phil Hartman sketch called Metro Card, where it's like a person with a credit card like calling customer service? Do you know this sketch?
I don't. I don't know it. Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, so it's like Roseanne Barr being very shirty and telling Phil Hartman basically he can shove it where the sun don't shine. And Phil Hartman says, "She gave me several options."
She gave me a lot of options.
And I feel like there might be moments in that founder relationship with the investor where it kind of feels like that on different sides.
The book is it is so I've already read passages aloud to my co-founder, and I mean it is laugh out loud funny, and some of these passages are just like, oh my, is that actually in the book? Like that's what happened to us. I'm like, no, it is actually what's in the book. It's very good. Yeah. Anyway, it's extraordinary.
The funny part to me and the stuff that is that actually in the book or Liz, right? That's
I just love the way it's constructed where you've got, and she is definitely like, she's sassy. It's great. I mean, just for lack of a better word, she's very funny. And I actually think that, but I actually love because your sections are very boots on the ground. I think they're very clear-eyed. I'm sure funny as well. I feel like this is coming across as a criticism. I didn't mean that. I'm sure there's much humor in your sections as well.
Funny, damn it.
That's right. But no, it's also I love the fact it's a great idea because I think that what you were trying to get at is like, look, there's not one truth in a company. Like there can be multiple truths, and here are different perspectives. And I also love the bits you agree on. So great book.
Yeah.
Everyone should read it.
I mean, it really was, you read other books written by people and it's like, well, let's find the middle ground. And I think in real life, there sometimes isn't middle ground, and you just need to know that.
Yeah, and then you do have the things where you both have found the middle ground. Like that's in some ways like the stuff that is like really gold is where you and Liz both agree on like, no, these are the things we agree on. Like, okay, that's like correct. The stuff anyway.
Yeah. Really although there were definitely times in the writing where she would say something and while we were writing, I'd say, you can't say that. I'm saying that. And she's like, oh, you're right. I'm like, you got to see the other side.
You got to see the other side. Yeah, that is great. Well, and clearly, I mean, it built on because I mean, you invested. I have not read the entire book. I've only it arrived and I kind of picked at a couple of passages and then was laughing out loud. And I need to actually properly sit down and read it. But you invested in her. Is that right? You have a relationship from actually having a company.
Yeah, no, I invested in her first company. I think I was probably the first professional investor, invested in her second company. And then I've now invested in her third company. So yeah, no, we've had I've known her for a long time.
That is great. Well, in translation, she's made you some money because I did when at a previous company, I was going in with the CEO. We were trying to raise money and there was a lot of hair on the company, so it's hard to raise for. He's like, this is going to be a pretty easy conversation. I'm like, oh, why do you say that? He's like, I made these guys a lot of money in a previous gig. And we went in and I'm like, that was a really easy conversation. He's like, well, yeah, once you've made. But that's how we end up with The Melt. The Melt was, you remember The Melt, the sandwich?
Of course, yeah, Jerry? The venture-backed grilled cheese.
Oh, yeah.
Sequoia-backed grilled cheese because the guy made all the money on flipping Flip, ironically, to Cisco for like $641 or something like that. Adam, it was just crazy. Remember that? And you're like, why did Cisco buy Flip? Do you remember Flip, Jerry? These are the video company.
Yeah.
Right. Do I? I was on the cap table. Those guys made me admit I was in on the melt. I was the first money in on the melt.
I have to say, Liz's new company is not the melt. And she had a few when she was ideating. A couple of ideas were kind of like, maybe not that. But in the end, she gets the pick. But it was I would have invested in anyway.
Well, that's kind of interesting because, so Adam, you and I have a shared acquaintance who was in the third company of someone who had had 2 outsized successes. And he was like, this is great. Like this guy, like he's had 2 outsized successes. I'm like, a third company is danger zone because he thinks it's not that hard. I mean, maybe he wouldn't say that, I'm sure, but at some point in his heart, he's like, this isn't that hard. I've done this twice. I can do this again. And it's like, no, the third one is the one to be like the immune system has been suppressed. And that was Impact Crater, I believe, Adam. I think it was a 0, that particular company.
Right. Yeah.
So a little bit of a chip on their shoulder, I think. Somebody who really feels like they need to accomplish something. And that's Liz still has. Yeah.
There you go. Liz is still hungry. That's terrific. Well, anyway, great book. We're going to have to talk about that another time because that's actually not why we're here. We're here to talk about this 2015 piece that you wrote that was on the deployment age, which was pointed out to me by a listener to the podcast. I think is here as well. But I had discovered, and I don't even know how I discovered it. Or how I hadn't discovered it earlier, frankly. Carlota Perez's book, Technological Revolutions in Financial Capital. And Jerry, I got to tell you, when I read this book, I'm like, how have I not read this book? I've not encountered this before. And it was like very thought provoking. I don't agree with all of it, but it's very, very thought provoking. And then I was pointed to your piece, which is like, okay, I'm not the first person to discover this. How did you discover Perez's work? Am I the last person on earth to discover this? I just, again, I don't know why it's taken me this long.
No, it's actually super interesting, right? Because I was just talking to my wife about this, and she is not canon, right? It's not economic canon. All the Schumpeterians are out of canon. So the 20th century was completely like the mathematization of economics of steady state, figuring out where supply meets demand and saying that's where we go, and not talking about change because change is too hard to fit into the framework that they were still building. And yet people like Schumpeter who were like, well, okay, but none of this is true, right? Because if things keep changing, and then she and the mainstream of economics said, okay, that's true, but we're not going to talk about that. We're not allowed to talk about that. And that's maybe not entirely fair, but it is primarily true that the mainstream of economics doesn't like to talk about change. And this is where she comes in.
Wild to me.
It's true, right?
I actually thought Schumpeter was canon.
Well, yeah, I mean, he's probably the most famous.
I thought it was something that was. Yeah. Huh. Yeah.
But
interesting.
It's not like. But yeah, no. So the idea that there are these kind of long waves of technological change that she describes is an old idea. I mean, they're called Kondratiev waves from this Russian economist from 1920 or something, who noticed that there are these ups and downs not in the economy per se, but in the economy and in what's driving the economy to grow. And said, he kind of said there are these 60-year waves. And economists since then have taken that idea and given it more body. And she was one of the first to really put together a convincing and sort of holistic explanation of why this would be so. Because you think well, why 60 years? There's no clock on the economy, right? Why isn't it 20 years or 80 years or something else? And why are these waves at all? Why isn't it steady progress? So this is she wrote this book as an explanation, and I don't think it's a mainstream book. So no, you're not the last person to read it. I think most people haven't read it, and if you brought it to your economics professor in college, he probably hasn't read it.
I'm not really on speaking terms with my economics professor in college. I think we both agreed to disagree on a lot of things. So I think we both agreed that we actually, in fact, did not value one another's perspectives, and maybe it was time for us to go our separate ways.
Right.
And what she describes is this kind of you have this early eruption with an I, where you have this kind of explosion of you've some big bang event that opens kind of a new frenzy, gives way to this frenzy of allocation of capital, that you get too much capital effectively, which he calls financial capital versus production capital. And I got to tell you, I thought you did a much better job of explaining the difference than she did in her book, because as you described in your piece, it took a little while to internalize what she meant by financial capital versus production capital. And you have this crash where then after the crash, it's more production capital than financial capital. Do you want to describe that difference a little bit? Because I think they're kind of strange terms. And it kind of how you redefine them a little bit.
Let's take the information communications technology revolution, which is the one that we're in now, right? And she says, like, all right, this started in 1971 with Intel's release of the first real microprocessor, the 4004, and it starts off slow, and people don't really see the use of this new technology. They it may be an interesting technology, but they don't think that it's going to change the world. Nobody thought that about the 4004. Even after Apple was founded, like, people weren't like, oh, a personal computer is going to change the world. Some people said that, right? But and now there's kind of this selection bias where we go back and we're like, oh, look at these people who knew what was going to happen. But most people didn't. If you look in the New York Times and search for personal computers in the 1970s, they mentioned personal computers in all of its different names, home computers, portable computers. They mentioned them like 8 times. Like, it's just nobody's paying attention to this for years, right? Because it's not making a difference yet. Like, there's nothing you could do with the Apple II computer besides play games. Like, nobody did anything with it. No, you could have, right? But nobody did. Nobody was running a business on an Apple II except maybe a couple crazy people. So it wasn't changing the world. But at some point, people started to say, hey, I can see where this might go, where this might go. Right. And you get some venture capitalists coming in and saying, like, in this era, venture capitalists, in previous eras, it was different sources of capital coming in and saying, this could be big. This could be really big. And I'm going to bet on it. And, she calls it more of a casino. Like, people are taking huge risks in the hope of huge gains. And this is financial capital, right? The financiers, the venture capitalists in this wave come in and say, hey, we can make this technology more productive. We can make it more useful by spending money on, putting money into companies that are going to make it a better technology and bring it into places where it hadn't been before. And this is really, so that's the financial capital part. And this is why it leads to, like, the frenzy, the dot-com bubble, because the financiers who are making bets don't have a lot of information to go on, right? They don't know, right? They don't would you have invested in Apple when Apple started? I mean, think about it, right? I mean, it's easy to say yes in retrospect, but when you go back and you look at it from as if you were there at the time, I mean, Steve Jobs, like, his long hair, no shoes, smelled. I mean, no job. Why would you invest in this guy?
When you talk about the selection bias, it's also like, you got to remember how many different computer companies there were in 1981, 1982, 1983. I mean, there were so many computer companies, and some of which had seemed much more promising than Apple. So it's a little unreasonable to think that one of the companies that we always view as a cautionary tale is Osborne, and because Osborne actually had product market fit, but ultimately went out of business because they operationally failed. They literally bought the wrong stuff at the wrong time while they were they just went insolvent, and it happened very, very quickly. So yeah, absolutely, you cannot kind of retcon.
I mean, there were scores, right? Scores.
And then so then you have this crash, and then and then after the crash and the kind of the embers of this the kind of the nuclear winter that follows one of these crashes, you begin, instead of having financial capital, you have what she calls production capital. And how did I actually liked your definition of production capital, because I don't think she really defined it very well. It was actually very helpful to have you kind of catalyze that.
I did, because I read the book and I'm like, what is she talking about? So I tried to explain the things that I didn't get. So you have, during the first part, with its financial capital, all the money's going into building the technology, trying to make the technology better. But then when there's the crash, the financiers tend to kind of step back a little bit and say, hey, all right, we kind of got out over our skis. We took too much risk. We need to be a little more careful. Usually the government gets involved and says, all right, you guys just lost a lot of people, a lot of money, and we need to make some regulations, which happened after the dot-com crash, right? And so things tend to get a little calmer. And also there are now big companies, right? Because they use this money from the boom to become big. And these big companies have money, but the big companies aren't going to take crazy risks, right? They're going to try to build their businesses. So they're going to use their money to say, how do we become a better company? How do we become a bigger company? How do we take more market share? How do we provide the things that our customers are asking for, or that we know that our customers need, as opposed to Apple, which nobody was asking for. There were like 10 people asking for a home computer. All right, 10,000 people asking for a home computer, but there wasn't a market, right? Nobody was asking for the Apple II. Nobody was asking for the Apple I. But Google, when they put out Gmail, they're like, people need this, right? This is something that people need, right? So they're spending production capital to make their own businesses bigger. This is like I've written elsewhere a lot about like nighty and uncertainty, the idea that there are some things you can't predict. These are things where they felt they could predict with some sort of, not certainty, but they could roll the dice, right? They could say like, this is a good bet. We're going to make money on this, 50% of the time. It's a rational decision versus the financial capital sort of not really rational decision, right? It's the animal spirits thing. So the production capital is all rational decisions.
So I've got, and here we have arrived at Bryan hot take number 1. I've got many hot takes, by the way, but this is so here's my first hot take. So my first hot take is from having been, and Adam and I, just for full disclosure, have been on the inside of big companies. We worked at Sun Micro. I was at Sun Microsystems for 14 years. Adam and I were at Sun together, and we convinced Sun to start something wholly new that became $1 billion line of business for what was then Oracle, sadly. But I actually don't think I think that the distinction is actually a little bit different. I actually don't think the distinction is around risk. Because I think inside of Google, I think Gmail, nobody thought Gmail was going to become what Gmail is today. Folks can correct me if they're on the inside and they disagree. I don't think inside of Apple, I don't think anybody thought that the iPhone, yes, you kind of have this like abstract vision where this is what it could be. But in this, again, my hot take is that the fundamental difference is that production capital is not building to flip. Whereas venture capital is building to flip. I've got to find a buyer for this thing. And I've got to find a buyer, by the way, like within 10 years or within 5 years if I'm SoftBank. I got to be in and out in 5 years. And when we started this, the term gets denigrated, but I like it, an entrepreneurial effort inside of Sun that we called Fishworks. And I always viewed it as like we had one investor. But that investor, on the one hand, like we had to deal with, some of the organizational battles, as Adam remembers very well. Mm-hmm. But that investor honestly had a very long time horizon and didn't really have to have contentious board meetings about not hitting targets. I actually think that there's still uncertainty there. But the risk tolerance is really different, and you can actually do something riskier when you are inside the confines investing production capital. That's feel free to disagree, but that is hot take number 1 on this.
Well, what year was that?
That was in 2006 that we started that.
Okay.
So the 2006, we believed that we could be a $1 billion top line within 4 years of shipping a product. We shipped our first product in 2008. Oracle, sadly, this is where I've got some degree of culpability. Listeners to the podcast like to create their own bingo cards, by the way. So you've got people who have just been able to check off Oracle off their bingo card. They're really elated. Sadly, we were able to attract Oracle as a customer to Sun for the first time in half a decade. Which is basically like taking a severed tuna and waving it in the water. We were basically chumming for an apex predator, and all of a sudden the dorsal fins of Larry Ellison appeared and ate the company. So I've always felt like some degree, I'm not sure if I confess it here or not, Adam, but I've always felt some degree of culpability that it was our own.
Huh. I don't know that you've even confessed that to me. I didn't know that you felt like Fishworks accelerated us being consumed by the predator.
But you remember the Oracle deal? That we had a huge Oracle deal as Fishworks.
I've forgotten that. No, I forgot about that.
But you remember it now that I mention it.
Yes,
they were
of course,
actually a
yes.
very technical customer that was very, very interested in Fishworks, and they had like outsized ambitions for us. It was great.
Yeah.
It was like, oh, this is great.
A
Oh
little
man, this is gonna be
too
great.
outsized, yeah.
This is gonna be great. It's like, wait a minute. Why are you so close to me? This is a little uncomfortable. Like, what are you doing? Why are you opening your mouth? But yeah, I always felt like, oh man, I should not have, because in that whole drama. So Jerry, there was a bidding war between HP and IBM, each trying to, one, sabotage the other, and two, they each wanted to pay the least amount as kind of to denigrate and desecrate, frankly, an old competitor and Sun. So they reached basically screwing around with the deal, and then Oracle swept in and bought the company. Oracle. Yeah. 100 Oracle, a production company built around financial capital. That's a financial capital company for sure. They do not care. They do not have the same disposition as Sun. But I think the iPhone is the same. It'd be interesting that, like, inside of Apple, I mean, because the iPhone was given. I mean, I think I've said this here, Adam, but like when the iPhone came out, I was a detractor, and I was not alone. I mean, no. Adam, you were not a detractor, and I feel it was a more lonely position for you.
I think that's right. Well, you certainly made it feel lonely. No, I know it's insufferable during those Fishworks days.
Spit Diet Coke on the mic again.
I mean, I think this is, look, companies are run by people, right? And Steve Jobs coming back to Apple after having been fired and having to prove that he was going to grow this company again had him take more chances than anybody who, if what's his name had stayed at Apple and run Apple, right? So, I think that it's wrong to treat this kind of theory, like Perez's theory, as science. It's not science, right? This is a description of things, of a process. And I do think, like, anecdotes aside, if you look at the overall business climate today, or 10 years ago even, versus the corporate business climate in the 1990s, you see a big difference in the kind of risks people are willing to take.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so let's take that apart, because I definitely agree with you about you've got to be really careful. And actually, Perez herself warns about being overly prescriptive with her theory. She's got a great paragraph about it shouldn't be a straitjacket. And then she proceeds to kind of stitch a straitjacket together, frankly, for the rest of the book. So there's like a little bit of a duality in there. But so, Jerry, one of the questions I have for you is, she cuts these kind of big, these 5 big waves, and then tries to, apparently as recently has said, like, no, the information and telecommunications boom that started in 1971, we are not yet in the crash. We are still in the what she calls the installment phase versus the deployment phase.
Totally. And it's I completely disagree with her. Completely.
100% disagree. Come on. Yeah.
But I mean, the interesting thing, and I completely disagree with her. I know I'm right, and she's wrong. But I also realize that, she's probably smarter than me. So what that tells me is, like, it's actually really hard to see when you're in the middle of it,
I agree.
So, is she wrong? Well, yeah, she's wrong. Of course she's wrong. But I'm sure that's what she'd say about me. I don't know. Once you get into the production capital phase, things change, right? Like in the part when it's financial capital, there's a lot of money being spent on building the technology, but the technology is not being used in ways that create more productivity and thus economic growth so much. And this was, there was always the economists wailing about how the computer wasn't showing up in the productivity stats from 1980 until 2000, right? It's the computers everywhere except in the productivity stats. But that's all. That was all. Somebody, who was it? Oh, David wrote. What's his first name? An economist, last name David, wrote an article called "The Dynamo and the Computer." I think that's the name, and talked about how during the technological revolution around electricity, the same thing happened at the beginning when dynamos were being installed. People were spending money on installing dynamos and improving dynamos, not on using the dynamos to create productivity. So and that was where the money was going, right? So you didn't see a lot of TFP growth. So, but then after the production capital takes command, not complete command, but overall command, they start saying, well, how can we make more money with this technology? And the way you make money is by putting it out in ways that makes customers' lives better, right? So somehow you're creating this economic growth, and that's why people are buying it. And
totally.
In that part, and what should happen then is you're going to see the value that's being created spread more widely to more people in the economy. So, after World War II, in the last wave, you had like the 1950s, which was the golden age, right? Where the value being created by the technologies, the automobile, mass production, gets spread more widely throughout the population, or at least the population that was allowed to take part in the economy, and their lives became better. So that should be the sign that you're already in this second half deployment phase, and I think we saw that, right? I mean, I put in this chart that I just put in the chat, like if you look at 2010 to 2019, there was actually amazing economic growth, and people's lives were getting better, even though everybody was telling us that everything was getting worse. There's a lot of propaganda around that. In fact, life in this country was getting better for the average person. So that to me is a sign that you're in the second half where the technology is being rolled out and being used in ways that makes people's lives better, not still in the first half where people are working really on making the technology itself better, not using it in ways that are productive. So I don't see how we can't already have been in the deployment age for at least 10 years now.
I think we've been in deployment age for at least 10 years. I think, and then that deployment age then did I think what she rightfully points out that happens when you get deep into the deployment age, where then these very large institutional entities that we've relied upon to allocate capital post the crash, done so effectively, gives us, I love your Gmail example, gives us Gmail, gives us the iPhone, gives us Facebook prior to 2012, gives us Facebook when it was uplifting for people, right? Gives us kind of early social networking. There's a bunch of stuff we have. And I love this conference that you originally presented this work at, Transition, in 2015. So the site that you linked to is gone. So I had to go to the Internet Archive to find it. But it's kind of mesmerizing. I don't know, Jerry, when you last looked at the agenda for this thing, but you go back and you just realize that, like, wow, 2015 was a long time ago. And this is because there's this whole idea of like, we are going to create the global middle class and the lives are getting better and we're in transition to, software is going to rule everything and that's going to make everything better and uplift everybody. So one of, again, Bryan's hot take number 2, and again, there are going to be many of these, is that the revolution that Perez often predicts, I think that may have been the 2016 election, where there's this kind of, and you also have, during that, I think that you can argue that there are a couple of different shocks in there. I do think that a lot of these big institutions very much lost their way. You have Facebook obviously lost its way. And there's one by one, these kind of companies. Google originally sets out as don't be evil is like the kind of tongue-in-cheek motto of the company, and then becomes like the legalistic bar that they use to apply to their own actions. No, that wasn't evil. That was only super shady. That was not actually evil. That's fine. It's like, no, that's actually not what you were. That was not what don't be evil meant in 2004. That's not what it meant a decade earlier, or a decade and a half earlier. So yeah. I actually wonder, I totally agree with you and agree that Perez is wrong. That revolution clearly, but we did see all of this late stage stuff. And one of the late stage things I wanted to ask you about is this kind of perversion where production capital becomes financial capital with buybacks. And you have these dividends from the dividends, lowercase d, kind of like the profits from the iPhone, the profits from Gmail. Instead of being, and these companies have changed, they'll pay out proper dividends, but they would actually use that to actually buy back their own shares. Is that production capital becoming financial capital?
Well, this is, there's so many interesting questions that Perez doesn't answer. And I think because this isn't mainstream economics, you don't really have like people who want to become professors writing about this, right? But although I would say that, if you think about the 1960s, which was the end of the last wave, and you think about the financial markets from the 1960s into the 1970s, the 1970s were an awful time to be an equity investor. Like there was just nothing was happening. There was like no reason. Like, right? That was when people would, you think back to the 1970s and, not that I remember the 1970s that well, but, it was the bond traders were like the BSTs on Wall Street, right? And bond traders, like really? And it's because the equity was nothing. And the big companies paid dividends, which dividends and buybacks are the same thing, right? Essentially, besides the taxes, they're the same thing. So what happens is as the market starts to get saturated, right? Like the computer market is now pretty saturated. There's not everybody's needs are being taken care of. There's not a lot of new needs that, if you're gonna build something new that is a computer technology, you're probably going to take money from some other computer technology company, right? It's just there's no more market to grow into. So what do companies do?
Is now when we reference back to our previous episode on raising our $100 million Series B, definitely not from corporate venture capital. Yes, I understand. I understand the point you're making in the abstract. The current company excluded, of course.
But so what do you do if you're Google, right? Where are you going to spend all that money? Like you can't invest it all if it's production capital. Like there's just not enough productive things to invest it in. So you're going to do stupid things like start Google Ventures. Like not that Google Ventures is stupid. It's some really smart people work there, but it makes no difference to Google. Like how much money can Google Ventures make that would change anything at Google? Like it can't, right? It could have the biggest outcome in the world, and it wouldn't change Google's earnings by anything. Nobody cares.
Have you presumably have you co-invested with GV or dealt with GV? GV truly loves to have it both ways, because you're like, are you Google or are you not Google? And they're like, well, what do you want the answer to that question to be? Yes. Like if you want us to be Google, we are absolutely Google. But no, if you don't want us to be Google, that's why we're GV. Google's not even in the name. It's GV, not Google Ventures. You're like, all right,
just nice to put their really smart people who want to go somewhere else, right? It's like, oh, don't do this instead.
Yeah, right.
I mean, seriously, they could be Sequoia and it wouldn't change Google's earnings, right? I mean, barely.
Right.
So, it's not, that's not, it is financial capital, but that's not what's happening. That's not the story. That's not the show. The show is, Google makes a shitload of money. What are they going to do with it? Well, they could pay dividends, but that's not the thing people do these days because it's tax inefficient. So they do buybacks.
Interesting.
And I think, but that's not financial capital because they're not making bets on things that are, these crazy bets, right?
So the other thing I wondered about is, Perez draws these kind of huge waves and wants to have, only 5 in her lifetime. But I think it's actually more instructive, or to me, it was more valuable to think of it as smaller waves. Because I feel in my career, there was a PC frenzy in the early 80s that collapsed and changed, and you got investment capital changing from financial capital to production capital in personal computers. That happened in software in the later 80s. That happened in the internet, obviously, with the dot-com bust. It's like when I look at these as kind of smaller things, because like mobile, I view mobile absolutely was a frenzy and a crash and in fact, the Andreessen's Software's Eating the World piece in 2011 is actually written at the peak of that mobile frenzy. I don't know, Jerry, when was the last time? Look, I'm...
this is our favorite party trick here.
This is our favorite party trick. It is our favorite party trick. It is the Software's Eating the World, written in 2011 by Mark Andreessen. It's like, okay, wow, software's important. Thank you for such a high thought. Who do that? But Andreessen does us the favor in 2011 of giving us example companies that are the exemplars of software devouring the world. Do you know what those companies are?
Are any of them still in business?
That's a great question. That is a question for the investors or debt holders of Zynga, Foursquare, Groupon, Living Social, and Rovio. Those are the 5 companies he names. How have you pulled off the magic trick of people like, this guy's such a genius for this essay? It's like, could you read all of it? It's like, it's like you would literally be much better. No mention of NVIDIA, obviously, it's 2011, NVIDIA or AMD, or even there are lots of companies that are, anyway.
It's funny, right?
That reflects its time.
Sorry, go ahead.
That reflects those companies actually reflect the apex of a frenzy around mobile, right? That's Zynga, Foursquare, Rovio, Living Social, Groupon. Those are like the companies where mobile is eating the world. And they're all wrong because there is a crash and those companies actually don't have the staying power.
Yeah. I think I think there's 2 points I want to make here. One, I totally disagree with you. And 2, I'll get to that one in a minute because it's longer. But 2, I think he was both early. It's funny when he said that, it was obvious, right? Software's in the world. Of course it is. And if you had read Perez, you're like, well, yeah. That's the book's about that, right? That this technological wave is going to change all of society and remake society around itself. And in 2015, I put some predictions in the deck, which people come back to me like, "Wow, those predictions really came true." I'm like, "Yeah, I was kind of thought they were silly when I made them because it was already obvious they were going to happen, right?" But I also think he was a little early because he was still in the part where things hadn't quite settled down yet, right? I mean, it was still the beginning of deployment. The other one, the part where I disagree with you is, there's definitely different waves. I mean, and I make this point sometimes. You look at the chart of Moore's law, right? Moore's law, S curve, mostly exponential for the most of our lives. Maybe flattening out a little bit now, arguably. But if you look at that underneath, it's one big curve, right? But if you look underneath at the underlying technologies, optical lithography was definitely peaked and then went away. And then you had, X-ray lithography. I mean, like there's a bunch of different technologies that built into this bigger wave. And I think what she's saying isn't that there aren't different technologies that take part in this one big wave, but that because she's not talking about technology per se, she's talking about changing society, right? How technology changes society. So if you go back to like the Industrial Revolution, the first one, I mean, there were like water-driven, looms, right? And that changed things a little bit. But then there were other things that used the same sources of power, like, water-driven automation of tasks that used to be completely manual. And those together were the big wave that changed things. And the reason I disagree with you, or I feel like I have to disagree with you, and is because the financial capital / production capital thing is all-consuming, right? You can only pick one wave at a time because there's only so much money and there's only so many people. So if even if like in 2005, the technology that was going to kick off the next wave appeared, nobody would have backed it because they were busy backing this wave. So you look at like the first computer companies, right? Like the Eckert-Mauchly computer company I mentioned in that post. When they launched in like 1949, 1950, it was the first mainframe computer, like a commercial mainframe computer. Nobody would fund them. Nobody would give them financial capital because they were busy with the previous wave. They were busy funding things like car companies and, mass production, all the plastics, this stuff, right? So they couldn't raise money. They basically had to sell themselves. IBM had been around for almost a century by then in its various forms. All this stuff was rolled out as production, not financial. You can only have one wave at a time. And I think it's important, right? Because if you're in the middle of a wave now, you can't start a new one.
So I'm going to give you a counterpoint to that. And the counterpoint is going to be that, so you talk about Eckert-Mauchly, you also talked about DEC in the piece, and DEC funded by George Dorio, who in some regards is kind of the first venture capitalist. But I think that's a bit of a misread because there's no line from George Dorio to Silicon Valley VC. So Pierre Lamond, who was at Fairchild and was actually on Oxide's board, which is terrific. Pierre tells a story of how they wanted to leave Fairchild and start a company, but this is in 1967. VC doesn't really exist. And they had to go find a public company, take it over, and then raise money using the vector of being a public company. And that was National Semiconductor. Based on the success of Nat Semi, that was where Intel got true, proper. Intel is basically the first, I would say, real, even though DEC, yes, had a venture deal, as you pointed out. It's like DEC is a portfolio maker. He had a bunch of zeros because it was such a ridiculous deal for the investor, terrible deal for the entrepreneur. As you say, the ultimate entrepreneur got the ultimately worst deal in the history of deals. But when we actually get true proper venture capital, starting with Intel, and then beginning like growing very slowly through the 70s and kind of exists in the 70s, doesn't really become, I would say, a mainstream investment vehicle. I mean, you're the VC, but I would say it doesn't really become mainstream until the 90s, maybe even until later than that.
Oh, no.
Oh, okay.
I actually wrote a post about this as well. Sorry.
No, good. So you think it's mainstream earlier than the 90s, or you think it's mainstream later than the 90s? Because I think I can find VCs who would argue both directions on that.
I wrote this post called "Heat Death" about venture capital in the 1980s. That was actually probably my most read post. And it talks about the 70s and the 80s and the venture capital. But I mean, you're right. It didn't, venture capital didn't really get off the ground until the late 60s. And the first venture capitalists were like going door to door looking for small companies to fund. It wasn't what we would call venture capital at all. And
it certainly wasn't attracting like sovereign wealth funds, right? I mean, when you start getting like really much larger pools of capital pointed towards Silicon Valley. So here's my question for you / hot take number 3 / question is, I wonder if the presence of venture capital doesn't serve to absorb a lot of these booms and busts, because we end up with these micro frenzies that then bust out. And there are lots of these. We can talk, I mean, like you certainly get, obviously ones like Web 2.0 and crypto, but also like, I think they called it micro mobility, whatever name they came up with for scooters, right? I mean, there was a brief VC frenzy around scooters. And I remember, Adam, I can't remember if I told you this or not, but the first time I rode a Lime, I feel like I could see the whole thing in front of me, because I could see that like, this is going to be VC catnip, because it is capital that is just making money. It's just capital that like is like, there's no labor. I had an app. I walked up to it. I like used it for 10 minutes and it got money. And that is just going to be catnip for VC. And yet I could also see I think they're going to get thrown into Lake Merritt. I think they're going to be stolen, locked in garages. You know what I mean? You're just
you're thinking this as you throw it into Lake Merritt yourself.
I'm thinking as I chuck it into Lake Merritt, I'm like, you know where this one's going? Bottom of the drink. Give me another VC funded scooter, I say. But this was this kind, and didn't have the staying power but VC absorbed that. Like the public didn't wear that boom and bust. The public wore the .com boom and bust in a way. Again, that's a hot take / question. Hot question. I don't know, Jerry. How delusional do you think that is? That venture capital has served to absorb some of these.
I recognize that I am too close to what venture capital should be, just because that's what I did for so long, and I had a lot of disdain for some of what venture capital is or was. At different times. And so it's a hard question for me to say, but I know we're not talking about AI, but is people putting $100 million, writing $100 million checks into AI companies, is that venture capital, right? I mean, are they really taking a bet on this, or do they believe that this is a foregone conclusion, right? I think, the interesting thing, when I gave that talk 10 years ago, I said, the funny thing about Perez, because VCs love Perez, like they love talking about Perez. But the thing that Perez says, even then, Chris Dixon wrote a post about it. Fred Wilson wrote a post about it.
They may want to read her all the way to the end. Do they know that it kind of ends with a guillotine? I mean, are they like
exactly right? That's what I said. I said, this is weird, because what she's saying is that we're all obsolete, right? And I think the job has changed, right? I think a lot of venture capital has become basically front-running production capital. It's production capital, but they're doing it privately. And then they're like, okay, we're gonna build this company and sell it to you, right? And a lot of the autonomous driving stuff, right? Like, we're gonna build an autonomous driving company, which we can then sell to a company which needs an autonomous driving company, which is different than taking a bet on technology. I mean, I've certainly made investments, and I try not to do this, but there was one investment I made early on where I'm like, okay, this company might succeed, in which case I'll make a lot of money, or it might fail, in which case I'll sell it to Microsoft and make a little bit of money, right? That's not venture capital, right? I mean,
interesting.
And it did in fact fail, and we sold to Microsoft. Right. But it's like, all right, well, why wouldn't I do that? But it's not venture capital.
Interesting. So I absolutely agree with that. That you should really be taking a bigger swing and not aiming for the exit. But you think that like someone who's putting $100 million into a company at God only knows what kind of post money. I mean, like, aren't you beyond the window where you can reasonably be acquired by? I mean, it's like that's a very big acquisition for a public company, certainly.
Well, no, true. I don't think it's production capital in the sense that they're hoping to flip it. I think it's production capital in the sense that they think it's a foregone conclusion that there's going to be one winner here, that there has to be a winner here, because the bet doesn't make sense as a bet, right? And it's true. Like, so I'm going to plug the thing I just wrote, which is actually coming out in the Colossus Review this week. And what I wrote about was containerization, shipping containerization, not containers, shipping containerization back in the 1960s. Where there was a ton of money being put into it, and it was a new technology, right? I mean, it was an old technology, but the technological system was new, and people put a ton of money into it, not because they're like, I'm going to make this is a bet that I'm making. It's a risky thing. They're like, well, yeah, this is obvious. This is obviously going to happen. And I need to be one of the people who is big in it if I'm going to make money in it. And that's different, right? It's not saying, I believe in this thing. I believe that this could change the world. It's saying, this is the way the world is definitely going to have to be. And unless I make a huge bet, I can't be part of that. I'm not looking to make 10x returns. I'm just looking to make 15% a year. But, if I don't put this $100 million in, I'm not part of that at all. And I think that's a different kind of investing.
Yeah, interesting. And because as you point out in shipping containers, like there's not a Google or a FANG of shipping containers. I mean, shipping containers increased global prosperity, but it didn't. The benefits from that did not accrue to a single entity. They were very, I would say.
Would there be an IKEA without shipping containers?
Well, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, I mean, it's a benefit. Lots of folks are beneficiaries of it. But it is those benefits were much more evenly distributed than you would have, the benefits of, IBM's accounting machines in the 20s and 30s, where like the benefits of that went to IBM, and they were because even the punch cards were kind of one-time use, right? So like that was people were getting the benefits of using this stuff, but it was much less of a much more dispersed, I would say, diffuse for shipping containers. I got to say, I think like open source is the same way. I mean, open source is like indisputably essential for everything that we have built. You could not build literally anything today without open source, but the benefits of that do not accrue to really any. I mean, there are entities that benefited from it. Like you can argue that the Google is to open source what IKEA is to shipping containers, in that they were able to build Google because of open source. But the advantages to open source went far beyond Google's walls. Or maybe I should phrase that as a question. Well, like, what do you make of open source? How does that perspective?
I mean, there's two things here, right? One is like who gets to keep the value created from a new technology, right? And sometimes people can somehow create some sort of moat that lets them keep the value, and sometimes you can't. And sometimes, as with open source, they don't even want to, right? So the value then gets spread more widely. But shipping containerization, people wanted to create moats, but there was no moat to create because you couldn't own that, And I think the question with AI is there going to be a moat that people can build where the technology won't become more widely available, or that anybody can build the technology, and thus there's no money to be made, no excess money to be made, right? So this is with shipping containerization. Like there was a frenzy. People built a lot of ships early on, like they way ahead of demand. There was a bubble in building ships and in investing in building container ships, but there aren't any there's no companies you can really point to aside from Sealand, which was the very first company, the one that the guy who really brought shipping containerization to the world. He started Sealand and he made a bunch of money. He flipped the company. But you can't point to you can't point to a big shipping company that's like, well, that shipping company is because of open source. I mean, sorry, because of shipping containerization.
No, I think it's actually the analogy holds up remarkably well, because it's like Red Hat is the company that really made money off of open source. There was in addition to like micro mobility, the scooter little VC boomlet, there was an open source VC frenzy in Adam, what was that? 2013, 2014. I guess we can just track Docker. Docker. I think we just track Docker but it wasn't just Docker, right? It was a bunch of them. I mean, there were a bunch of companies that were, and this was when Ed, I don't know if you invested in any open source companies, Jerry, but I remember talking to one VC in particular who had explained to me that's like, no, the reason we're investing is because of Docker in particular. They'd invested in the H round of Docker, and I explained to him that he's going to lose his money. And he's like, no, we're not, because if you look at the adoption of this, the adoption curve is up and to the right, and anything like monetizing that kind of adoption is a much easier problem. And I'm like, okay, well, so I mean, just what you said earlier, Jerry, that kind of investors don't necessarily know what they're investing in. So this is part of what creates the frenzy, is they don't actually understand it. I'm like, you're not actually a software engineer, and I actually am. And the appeal of a lot of these open source technologies as a software engineer is that I know that procurement never has to be involved ever. I never have, and so I am attracted to the things that can't be monetized. And you, by looking at the download numbers from NPM on a keynote or what have you, you may actually be investing in those things that are the least monetizable. Right. And there was admittedly, the color did drain a little bit. He's like, do you think that's true? I'm like, I think that could be true. I don't know. I mean, you're the one that just
it's your money, right?
I don't know. You tell me. And of course, he was wiped out. Right? They were all crushed down by, and I think Benchmark got theirs out of Docker, but there were a lot of people that lost money on Docker. But it was not just Docker. There's a whole little VC frenzy around open source, kind of, but very similar to your shipping container example, where it's like, no, only CLAN is going to make money. Only Red Hat is going to make money on this. This is not, because this is the benefits of this are more diffuse. They accrue to more people in smaller chunks.
Well, and that's, I think, so to bring it back to something where we don't know what's going to happen yet, because that makes it more interesting, right?
Yeah.
Is that true in AI, right? Is OpenAI the only company that's going to make money? Or is it one of the other ones that have, are essentially the same vintage? Right? I mean, is everybody else going to be like, well, okay, we didn't make any money?
And when you say make money, didn't OpenAI realize that like they're going to be spending $87 billion more than they anticipated? Did I read that number correctly? From like,
yeah, I thought it was more than 87, but
it's like, wow, that is maybe by making money. I mean, and what do you make of it? What do you think? Because I do think it's like, I think that we are, and I think it sounds like we agree on this, that even as much as the revolution started in, say, 1971, it has gone through its installation, it's gone through its frenzy, it's gone through its crash, its deployment phase. And we're now in, I think, arguably with AI, we are in the frenzy period of a new revolution. And it sounds like
I disagree.
Okay.
Yeah, so no, I think AI is the maturity phase of the ICT revolution. And containerization. Shipping containerization was the maturity phase of the previous revolution, right? Because it brought together the technologies that already existed. I mean, look, AI, what is AI, right? It's computers thinking. Why did we build computers? We built computers to think. So AI is exactly what we asked for, right? I mean, that's what it is. Like, people are like, oh, nobody asked for this. I'm like, yes, this is exactly what you asked for. This is what it does. Right. So this is the final stage of the computer revolution. Is computers actually? I mean, I actually don't think they think, but this is the end game of the computer revolution. That's my opinion, and I think if it were the beginning of the revolution, it would be different, right? Like you'd have. So go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, Perez agrees with you. I definitely disagree with you, but Perez agrees with you. That's what she thinks too. She thinks this is like that AI, that she thinks that like the purpose of the ICT revolution was apparently to make chatbots that can rephrase things as like Seinfeld scripts or what have you. That was the end goal apparently. So
that's where we started all along in 1971, right? That was the ambition.
That was the ambition. So what do you make? So you do not think we're in a frenzy of a new stage? You think that this is this is more
just like shipping containerization and other late stage technologies. It's look, every revolution had late stage technologies that changed things. Like they were big deals, right? They were increased productivity, and the reason I think if this were a new revolution, it would be more like the computer revolution at the beginning, right? Where you'd have a bunch of people hanging out in somebody's garage, like talking about this, super psyched about it. But most of the world would be like, that's nothing. Like nobody cares, right? Because unless it's a surprise, you're not really following the track of Perez's theory. But
that did happen. So my counter to that is that did happen. That you had the Transformer papers written in 2017. You did have people that in 2017, 18, 19, those kind of years. I remember Adam, a guest that we've had on the show, Mike Caffarello, I've known Mike for years. I remember Mike, an AI researcher. I remember talking to him in 2019, and he was telling me that like language is a solved problem. I'm like, what? No, it's not. He's like, no, you just don't know it yet. But it is based on some of these early results we're seeing. We think it's a solved problem. And he was right. And so I think that was happening then. And you did have the transformer architecture very much coming out of production capital from Google. And then kicking off, starting with OpenAI. I mean, it is really hard to argue that we are not in a a financial capital frenzy right now. I mean, is that so? Ignoring Perez, do you or do you not? You believe this is not a financial capital?
I don't believe it is. No, I think it's a production capital.
Wow, you think it's a production? Okay, huh?
And so, I did write this thing 10 years ago, and my thinking is, I believe, different than Perez's in a lot of particulars. What I think really kicked off the computer revolution was a bunch of hackers being able to tinker with personal computers without getting permission from anybody, without having to spend a ton of money, right? And because they could do that, they could find uses that big companies wouldn't think of, because big companies are going to look for uses that their customers want, right? And this is sort of the Christensen disruptive innovation thing. When companies try to solve their customers' existing problems, they're not doing anything new, right? So I think if AI was cheap, if you could run it on your laptop, some of these small models you can, right? But if people were running it like small models on their laptops, trying to solve problems that only they had, then you'd come up with things that nobody else thought of, right? And I think that's what made the personal computer revolution so interesting, was people solving problems that nobody was asking to be solved. Because then they solved a new problem.
I think today. You don't think that's happening today? I think that is happening today. You think it's happening? Huh.
Well, I mean, there's certain things you're not allowed to do with OpenAI, right? I mean, you can't use ChatGPT in certain ways because they won't let you. Like, there's no permissionless invention here.
Yeah, but not with OpenAI specifically, but with other LLMs. And I wonder if there's an analogy here between, you talk about some of those early computer hackers. Some of that was enabled by this IC revolution, which was not cheap to achieve, right? Like, there was tons of money that went into to enable that. In the same way that there's clearly tons of money going in to train these models, right? These are not things that people could do in their basement with their $100 million worth of GPUs. I wonder if I wonder if we're going to see more of what you're describing as that hobbyist phase in the shadow of maybe that kind of the lithography and IC phase that we saw in computing earlier.
I think that, I would be surprised if that. The only thing that would prevent that from happening would be if they can't change the technology in a way that makes it cheaper to train, right? I mean, or cheaper to run. I mean, I think that should be possible. But I don't think that.
Yeah, I mean, the chime for our DeepSeek episode with the Streepers folks, and DeepSeek did do that. That is what DeepSeek did. So, I mean, I think that
why is OpenAI still spending $110 billion over the next, or whatever they said they were spending over the next few years? Like, if it clearly hasn't come down in price in a way.
It's so I think because it's a frenzy. I think because it is a financial capital frenzy. That's why. So it would be my answer to this. Would be that and I think that there are some open questions for everyone about what the advantage of scale. And right now, I think that this is not my domain, but it is, I think, a reasonable inference that there are people who continue to believe that if we can be that the only way to own this entire market is to be at the largest scale as fast as possible. And then it's going to be winner take all. I think that's got to be the thinking of folks that are investing in these very large model companies, is that it's going to be winner take all. I think it'd be interesting to know their perspective. I think from their perspective, maybe hey, there's a lot of capital being pointed here. And there are a lot of ideas that we have that are not merely improving the models. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we can go do, even though I throw up my mouth a little bit when I think AI, because I just can proxy Simon Wilson kind of having a heavy sigh when I say this. But I think the number of things where we are using an LLM in accordance with some more general purpose compute to just to do some things, to write some programs, certainly it's so much better as web search. And I feel that is so where the goals are not this kind of, we're going to build this super intelligence, but we're actually going to use this as a tool. And so I actually see us kind of transitioning pretty quickly, and it'd be interesting to know if there's going to be a crash or not, but through this kind of frenzy into what I think is going to be much more of a production capital footing. where we are going to see, I think that there's going to, I think that the crash such as it will be, certainly there are a lot of companies that have taken a lot of money that are not these kind of core model companies, I'm sure. Well, I guess you Jerry, you've retired from the field. And you had a great note, by the way, I got to say, when you announced your retirement from investing. I really have just like total admiration for that. Are you missing it with this? Or are you,
I can't write $100 million checks.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
No, I'm not. I am technical. That was my first job. I was a hardware designer for my first job. So I have, I think, generally been better at investing in things that are pretty highly technical, just as sort of a comparative advantage to the other VCs. So I do miss that part because this is pretty highly technical, and I find it super interesting. And I would love to be sitting down with founders and talking about what the next big thing is here. But I really don't believe that this is a revolution so much as it's an evolution of the existing computing paradigm. Because I don't think people are trying to do different things with it. They're trying to do the same things, but better.
I don't agree with that. I think that it's going to be, I think that we don't know where it's going. I think like a lot of these revolutions, I think, a mistake that people make is they think that whenever there's a frenzy and a crash, this is like, the Gartner hype cycle thing, right? If you have a frenzy and a crash, then, well, you must be getting to this kind of production capital nirvana on the other side. It's like, no, you can just be like the Lime scooters. You can just toss into Lake Merritt and that's the end. Like that is actually there doesn't need to be kind of a getting on a more permanent footing. But I think in this case, I think it's really going to change things pretty deeply. I think it's going to change education. It has to fundamentally change education.
Well, it's going to make educators. I believe it's going to make educators more productive, right? You can't get rid of educators, right? I am right. But you still need that person. You still need the doctor. But it's going to make doctors more productive. But this again, it's shipping containerization, right? It didn't invent Walmart, it didn't invent IKEA, but it made them more productive so that they could become bigger companies and spread their mission globally, much more broadly. And I think that's what's going to happen here is the value from AI is not going to accrue to the AI companies. It's going in the end to accrue to doctors and lawyers and educators and people in the knowledge, business.
So in that, Jerry, does that mean that AI kind of becomes commoditized? That these hundreds of billions of dollars is kind of a race to the bottom to some degree, and then these higher value services consume AI, provide services to their end customers, and that's where the value accrues. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, and commoditized or not, it could be that there's only a couple of model companies. It could be it's Microsoft and Facebook and like the Amazon like running big models, and OpenAI is maybe a new entrant there, but I think they're going to compete head to head, and you're going to choose the model that makes sense, or you're going to be able to run smaller models for cheaper somewhere else. And in the end, you're going to say, I'm not going to pay a ton of money for this. I'm going to use it. I think that it is a revolutionary technology. I think that it does things that computers couldn't do before. I think it's an amazing technology. I just don't think that value is going to be captured by these big companies, except for maybe one or two.
Yeah. Okay. And this is an important distinction because I think that I can see where you're coming from. The question is not valuation; it's around value capture. And what you're saying is, no, this is revolutionary. And this is where it's like the analog beat. No, this is revolutionary the way open source is revolutionary. Like indisputably
or the internet was revolutionary. Right.
The internet was revolutionary.
Still part of that same.
But shipping containers had its CLAN and had its IKEA, and open source had its Red Hat and its Google. And so does AI have, are there going to be entities like that it's not that they are capturing the value creation, but they are benefiting from that value creation to create something wholly de novo that they would not be otherwise able to do? And is that where the kind of, interesting.
Somebody always makes money.
Is this like the investor's mantra that you have in there's got to be,
you got to believe that to be an investor.
If you read that thing I wrote on venture capital in the 1980s, there was just something really interesting that I learned when writing that, which is that, people made money in disk drives, in backing disk drive companies, but they backed so many disk drive companies that the sector as a whole lost money for the investors. So, not a good place to invest, right? If you can't pick winners, and I don't think VCs are great at picking winners, they're great at picking sectors that might win, but they're not great at picking like this particular company, except later in the cycle. But if you're a seed stage investor, you can't be like, oh, of the 50 companies that are starting, this one's going to win, right? Because generally they're started by people who have no idea what they're doing, management wise, right? You can't be like, oh, these people are going to be the best managers. You're picking people who have great ideas and hoping that either there's very few companies or that all the companies win. Like that's how you make money. So I just think in AI, like there's too many companies. There's not enough money to be made. The sector as a whole is going to lose money. Somebody's going to make money. That's true. And they're going to be like, look, I made money. I'm a genius.
Yeah.
But that really is.
And I mean, Cisco is still not trading at its 2000 highs, right? I think that's correct. Someone can go look at but Cisco was, I mean, and Cisco, I picked Cisco because it like stayed, basically a healthy company. And so Cisco is still trading off of its March 17th, 2000 high, 25 years later. And Cisco, really tells you something about that particular frenzy. One thing I definitely wanted to ask you about, because one of the things that Perez talks about, I think is kind of interesting, is that when you have these crashes, you get changes, regulatory changes, regime changes, what have you. And one of the things the thoughts I just want to, again, maybe hot take number 4, another question for you. In the .com bust, one of the things that, and then in the kind of the ensuing, certainly in the financial crash 2008, but certainly in the .com bust, we changed some of the Enron collapse and some other things. Because Sarbanes-Oxley is in like 2002. When is Sarbanes-Oxley introduced? But we introduced things to make it to make sure that our public companies are more accurately representing themselves. But Silicon Valley views a bunch of these things as onerous, and companies stay private longer. I mean, Facebook goes public because they had 499 investors and they were out, and that's a cap that's now been lifted to 3,000. But they literally could not add a new investor; they had to go public. What do you kind of make of this trend, and how does this kind of affect this of companies staying kind of indefinitely private, not going public?
Well, I mean, first, I think, we definitely had regulation after the crash, but the regulation was so tepid that it made really no difference. I mean, Sarbanes-Oxley, come on, like, did that really make any difference? I think the tech sector totally dodged a bullet there. The regulations that could have been put in place were far more onerous.
Interesting.
I mean,
yeah.
You look back to back in the progressive era when they were putting in place like antitrust regulation and actually enforcing it, like that kind of stuff. That made a difference. This didn't make any difference. Not really, right? I mean, okay, Facebook had to go public. I mean, oh, boo-hoo. Everybody only became billionaire. I mean, right? I mean, like, I don't know who's complaining about that. I think.
When they were allowed to go public in a structure that doesn't allow the public to actually own them too, which is the thing that that I don't understand. That is, I genuinely do not understand how that Zuckerberg can't be fired because of the structure of the company, the governance structure of the company. It's like, how is that a public company? I mean, how's that?
Before Motor Company had the same structure, I think still does.
Is that right? Oh, interesting. Wow.
Anyway, but yeah, no, I mean, I think it's, there's nobody in the United States can complain about regulation. I mean, please. It's just, you're getting piggy if you start complaining about regulation here.
Silicon Valley does love to complain about regulation, though. It just feels like stop whining is what I got to say to Silicon Valley.
I think it's an expression of political power. I don't, whether or not they actually believe it, they can still make things better for themselves. I mean, you think about this at the end of the last wave, like, the people in Kennedy's cabinet, right? I mean, they were people out of industry, right? The big industries, people who ran companies. Like, there's sort of right. People talk about regulatory capture. There's also this kind of executive capture where people in the large industries, the largest industries of the day, end up becoming some of the most powerful people in the government, right? They can tell the government what to do. And that's not surprising. I mean, that happens every wave. And
we did that experiment. That experiment lasted, what did it last? 101 days, 91 days. What was the actual? How long did the Doge experiment run end to end? It was not long. It was brief.
I mean, why? I have invested in crypto companies, but really, like the whole government attitude towards crypto is like, okay, this isn't rational. Like this is not a rational attitude, and that's because there are people in the government now who have a ton of money, making a ton of money from crypto. I mean, it has to be right. Like I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I mean, I think this is just factual. But it's like, back in like, who was it back in like 1969 or something, where he said, well, what's good for GM is good for America. And this is,
Right.
what I said in that deployment age thing is what's good for Google is good for America. And that's what they think. And I mean, it's not entirely untrue, but it's also not really, it's kind of besides the point.
Do you think that a Perezian revolution is coming? I mean, because she really thinks that like these things end in total social upheaval, and I mean a lot of state interventions. Kind of what the state's got a lot of answers to a lot of questions that nobody asked from my perspective. But do you think that that's where we're headed with this?
Yes, I mean I think that's where we are. Like, isn't this social upheaval now?
It does feel that way. Like, yeah, what if not? Yeah, if this is not, if the president posting memes of himself as Apocalypse Now going into Chicago is not. Yes, sorry. I mean, I.
But even aside from what one insane person is doing, I think the fact that he was elected by a majority of people who voted, or close to. It says that there is a more widespread discontent with where
there's a widespread discontent.
Yeah. Even though, I mean, we just went through what I think was a golden age, and I think golden ages are hard to see when you're in them. But you look at average wage of non-managerial employees. You look at wealth, average wealth in this country of people who aren't in the top 10%. All the numbers were moving in the right direction. People were much better off in real terms than they were 15 years ago. And yet everybody was like, well, this sucks. And I don't think that's because everybody's saying this sucks because of the economy. I don't think it was because of the economy. I think it's because things were starting to stop changing, and we're humans. We look forward to making things better.
Okay, another kind of hot question, I guess. Do you think that the rise of intense social connectedness, social networking, was exacerbating some of those feelings of discontentment, where people can get, it used to be, in our day, if you were discontent, you went to go listen to the Smiths or something. I don't know. I mean, you just like you had just fewer outlets for your angsty discontentment, versus now you can go get ginned up on 8chan and become a groiper or whatever. Do you think that like that is we've kind of, that technology has created some of these vectors for discontentment magnification?
I mean, media does, yes. All media does, right? You get to spread your ideas. Is that a bad thing? I think it's easy to see the things that are wrong that are right in front of you. It's harder to see that people used to think the same thing about, books. They used to think the same thing about radio. They used to think the same thing about music, about video games. All new media technologies are demonized. And this might just be, I've been in the internet industry since 1995, so, people were demonizing it then, so I was a little defensive, and maybe I still am. But I don't think that if we didn't have social media, this wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I don't know that you think. I mean, I agree with you. I think that like one of the real problems is that in this big boom, the ICT boom, created really outsized winners, and that we gave a company the information monopoly, we gave a company the public infrastructure monopoly in terms of Amazon and AWS, we gave a company a big device monopoly, we gave us a small number of companies these kind of big monopolies, and the returns to those companies were outsized. And I do feel that those companies became disconnected from their own obligations back into the society or societies that helped create them. And they are, I mean, I do think it's kind of like crazy that everyone's, rooting on Perez. It's like, well, this ends in like real revolution where people begin to look at those returns from these companies, be like, this is not like, why aren't those returns being better invested societally? And, taxes is a reductive way to do that, but there are other ways to do that. And I do think that there was a long stretch where where some of these outsized returns were better invested. Again, I don't want to romanticize the past era.
Well, no, I think you're right. And Perez says, like, somewhere towards the end, like, it can either become a golden age or a gilded age, and it totally depends on how the government responds after the crash. I did think we had a tepid response, and I think we kind of had it somewhere in the middle. Life is better for most people in this country, or at least on average, or even median. But there's also a lot more inequality, and people hate that. It's funny. One of my old bosses used to say, like, well, don't look in my pocket. You're doing better. Don't look in my pocket. Just, you're making twice as much as you were. I'm making 10 times as much, but so what? You're still making twice as much. And it's like that, except that's not really true for people, right? Like, you see people who are, trillionaires. It's like, okay, that doesn't seem right. And I think people become discontent with that. Yeah. Especially when they can go and use that money just to buy the government.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the part of the problem is that, like, all right, look, trillionaires, like, you've got to find a way to plow you can't take it with you.
I think I said, like, in my resignation letter, I made enough, but I think for some people, it's not, look, I know people I went to school with who went into investment banking. It's not about the money, it's about keeping score.
Yeah, totally. So absolutely.
There's never enough, right?
That's right.
I think Elon Musk probably enjoys being the richest person on that planet.
Yeah. I just feel, because, famously, it was Buffett taking Gates' side, and that he needed to change his lies. And I guess this was what 2001, but maybe it was, but being with him to create start doing the foundational work, like start curing diseases, and it's like you've accrued a lot. Now you've got an opportunity to really do some meaningful things philanthropically. It feels like we're not. It feels like we are gonna get there kind of by hook or by crook. I don't know. Yeah, how does this thing end? I guess is my question.
I think it ends when people can look. There's the who was it, Emerson, moral equivalent of war, right? People need something to believe in. People need something to fight for. They need something where they can feel like they're making a difference in the world and making the world a better place, because that's who we are as humans, right? We are creatures of progress, right? We want to make a difference. We want to make things better in whatever better is for us. And I think if you don't give that to people in their lives, then they, resort to protest or sometimes violence. The 1960s wasn't like that. There was a lot of social unrest at the end of the 1960s. Less so in this country than in some other countries, right? there was some violence here, not mass violence. So it's it's manageable. And then you got into the 70s, and I think people were like, okay, I can see the future again.
I think this is where my mother would come off mute. She was the college class of 1968, and would be like, maybe your mother as well, Adam, be like, I'm sorry. The 60s and 70s were very, sorry, may I remind you about Kent State? Very tumultuous here in the U.S. And she'd always believed that we were always one draft away from being right back in the 1968. But point taken. That and also there was a lot of prosperity. You also, Jerry, you made another really good point. You kind of made this from a couple different angles, but you said it's very hard to perceive a golden age while you're in one. And just more generally, the point about Perez is like very hard to perceive kind of where you are in the phase of one of these revolutions while you're in it. And I think that's a very important point, because I think that sometimes it's we have this benefit of hindsight and don't realize that actually it can be hard. When you're living through a crash, I think, but it can be harder to know when you're living through a golden age.
Yeah, you look back and if you were a white man in the 1950s, it was definitely a golden age in this country, and the people who are allowed to participate in the economy. But I think those people weren't necessarily saying, "Wow, this is the best" at the time. Later, like 20 years later, people were like, "Oh, let's put a TV show like Happy Days on because it just depicts this era when everything was perfect," because that was remembered in retrospect as being a golden age. But at the time, I don't think Jack Kerouac wasn't saying like, wow, this is awesome. I love it now. Right? That's not what was happening.
Yeah. Is there a show like what is the Happy Days equivalent for the 90s? I think the 90s kind of sucked. Although actually, in hindsight, actually the 90s were actually great for many things. It was the end of the Cold War and there was a lot of prosperity and but this is the era for me personally. This is the era where Microsoft has the hammer lock over information technology. So it's a bit of a dark age till there was the internet.
Yeah, I think the TV show is my kids rewatching all of the episodes of Friends. And being like, wow, I'm going to have an apartment like that in New York City someday. It's like, yeah, no, you're not.
Does Friends have a? Because I actually was my 18-year-olds in college and just got to kind of DM me apropos of nothing about how I apparently had not seen Seinfeld. It's just like Seinfeld is unwatchably bad. I think the laugh track just. But maybe I'll turn them on to Friends. I don't know. Does Friends have a laugh? I think Friends has a laugh track, doesn't it?
Yes.
I believe
I don't.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
You're able to endure it. But the thing that my kids do pour over is The Simpsons, which is good for those of you who have that on your bingo card. That is the peak 90s. We did know we were living in a golden age. I would say that. I would say those.
The Simpsons.
The Simpsons. You knew. Now, and we are of similar vintage, but Jerry, you are a couple years further down the track where Golden Age Simpsons, you may have been a little more of an adult. That might have been a little bit like, actually.
It was,
I'm not sure. Oh, God, it was such an era. It's a great time to be in college. As I would tell people, every episode of The Simpsons was like a moon landing, the snack bar. No one had a television. So old. Anyway.
Yeah.
Well, Drew, this has been great. It's been really. First of all, I cannot wait to read your blog entry on venture capital in the 1980s. Do you feel? I feel that like every great investor is a little bit self-hating. Do you feel that way? I'm not trying to get you to denigrate your trade, but do you? I feel that you are more introspective than most venture capitalists. I'm just going to say it. I'm going to say what I'm thinking. I'm going to put it out there.
I don't think I'm more introspective. No,
Okay.
What I think it is I don't owe anybody anything. I didn't take outside money. I don't need anybody to be happy with me. I need some of my family to be happy with me. But I didn't have to. I can say what I want. And I think most venture capitalists can't. So I don't think I'm more introspective. I just think I'm just saying it,
I feel that you got a curiosity about the history of investment that not all venture capitalists have. I'll put it that way. I'm going to leave it at that. I'll stop insulting your trade, but I do feel that I really appreciate you've got these very thoughtful pieces. So this is,
thank you.
Really terrific stuff. And we're going to have you back. We're going to have a discussion about founder versus investor. Although actually, you know what? Because I do think maybe you should be able to bring because I think Adam and I are both going to be kind of on Liz's side on a lot of these disputes.
So that's okay.
I feel like
mind.
you should. Okay, all right, that's good. So you should be allowed to bring, bring your Vinod Khosla. I don't know who'd you bring. Sorry, that'd be a
get. You go get Vinod Khosla on the show, Bryan.
That was uncalled for. Which I really appreciate it. It's really great to get your perspective. I think it's a really valuable perspective. I think especially for folks that are kind of looking, trying to because I think the thing we have in common is trying to learn what can we learn from the past and what does that tell us about the future and how can that kind of guide the way we think about the future? Because some of this stuff is like we do see some rhyming with the past for sure.
Yeah, and that's really the most interesting question, right? What's going to happen?
Totally. What's going to happen? It's going to be wild. And we also have we do predictions every year. On the first episode of the year is our predictions episode. And we have to have you come back and if you want to get spicy. Well, yeah, exactly. We make 1, 3, and 6 year predictions. But with the aim of being, I would say, more entertaining than accurate. Although Adam, I went back through as I do, I went back through our predictions. So I like to go back through our predictions episode like halfway through the year, roughly. And it's because it is amazing to me. Part of the value of and part of the value of this discussion today, Jerry, is like when you look forward, it's just amazing how much you capture a moment in time. And even like 6 months, 8 months ago, I mean, it's now 9 months in, it's like January's a long time ago. And a lot of our, we've got some predictions that are timely, some predictions that are very quaint. So it's
sure. Yeah. This January was like 10 years ago.
That's right.
It was a long time ago.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me on.
Oh, you bet. Absolutely. Welcome anytime. And like I said, we're going to get you Founder versus Investor is going to be read aloud quite a bit around here. So I thank you again for that. We'll have to have you back. And we'll be back next week. We're going to have some of the operations folks, Adam, talking about some of the challenges of manufacturing at scale. So that's going to be a great one.
Yeah, it's going to be great.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.